Welcome to Green Priorities, the podcast series dedicated to talking about the green transition. I'm Aidan Clark, along with my co-host Andrew Prentice. Food is essential for our nutrition, but also for our culture, our lifestyles, our way of engaging with one another. And yet, food is at a critical state of vulnerability. Food resiliency, food security are down, having peaked in the last few years. Not only that, affordability and availability are also critically impacted. At the moment, the cost of maintaining our agriculture, our global supply chains, is risking the nutritional and cultural integrity of our food. You join me now with Andrew as we discuss food. So, this is our fourth and final episode on food systems. Last 3 episodes, we've looked at the history of food systems, the concept of our modern food system. We've looked at alternative agricultures, and we've looked at animals. So the last part is really the sort of distribution and consumption side, the last mile, as some people call it, of our food system. So where should we start in understanding this last mile?
I think we'd start with probably refrigeration. Refrigeration sort of connects packaging, distribution, transportation generally. The cold chain is really is the defining feature of our agricultural system today. You know, in so much as it allows for globalized trade, you can transport anything anywhere because of refrigeration. But also in terms of the fact that, so much of our food, say, comes pre-cooked, pre-packaged, but that also requires it to be refrigeratable, right? It has to have space to go from place to place to place so it can stay cold. If you're not going to make your own pasta at home, it has to be, if you're going to buy, say, cooked pasta like tortellini or whatever you're buying at the store, it's got to be go from, the people who make it at the factory to the grocery store to you, and it's got to be refrigerated that whole way along because there's ingredients in it, because it's cooked, as opposed to, say, bringing dry ingredients to your home and then cooking it there. So the refrigeration sort of deals with packaging, it deals with transportation so far as all the boats and planes and cars and trucks are refrigerated that carry everything. Um, but I think really it is a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of allowing for the full commodification of food. It allows food to be sort of traded anywhere in spite of being perishable. It allows it to sort of be a bit cherry picked out of place so you can have the perfect oranges out of season. It means that the seasons sort of no longer are relevant as they used to be because it can come from somewhere else, because it can be kept for longer. And I think refrigeration sort of pulls all those things together.
Sometimes kind of people refer to the era we're in as the Anthropocene, which means this sort of era totally overdetermined by human impact and input. I mean, it's sort of like that phrase too, the hothouse flower, the flower that can only grow in the greenhouse. Our food system is a little bit like this flower, except it's not just reliant necessarily upon extremely warm conditions, but just on these very artificial conditions of the supply system that we've built. I mean, do you think it'd be fair to say that, for instance, perishability is not so much a quality of food, though of course it is, but much more a quality of the particular food that we produce? Right now, the sort of vulnerability to perishability, the refrigeration problem in the first place that we have, is a result of having a globalized food system, not necessarily an inherent problem of food itself.
Definitely. And you see that in, like I was saying before, the fact that so much of our food comes additionally processed to us, it requiring refrigeration steps. If you were a person who, say, caught a fish 100, 200, 300 years ago, you might salt that fish, you might dry that fish so it would last a long time, and you're collecting it from much closer to the source. Lots of the time, the food that you're getting from your grocery store has already been refrigerated for a very, very long time before it even gets to the grocery store where you buy it and then keep it for longer in your fridge. So I think we maybe even underestimate sort of like what the fridge can do for us. If you were to actually pick strawberries in your own garden and put them in your fridge, they would last for, ages and ages and ages, as compared to the, say, scant week that you might get out of strawberries that are in your fridge, um, that are coming from elsewhere, right? Especially in the wintertime.
And there are whole food systems, cultural food systems that have emerged through trying to overcome things like winter or using obviously preservation, which I think we'll get to later in the episode. But processing is such a crucial part of food. I mean, the processing is not sort of an accidental feature of food. It's basically what food is. I mean, food is this complex process of refinement and assembly. There's nothing trivial about the way that we process the food, and what our food looks like is overdetermined by the processing that we do. So if you have a global system, and therefore a kind of global process of putting food together, of putting raw materials, again, of distribution and eventual consumption, then yeah, you get a kind of global food in certain respects, and it maybe help maybe sort of. So we have refrigeration. What's the next step, though, in terms of the basic building blocks of the distribution chain?
For sure. So after, I mean, initially when things are taken, sort of picked, they're actually flash frozen. That's the first step. They're flash frozen at the field to preserve all of the nutrients and freshness of whatever we're doing. So whether that be strawberries or lettuce, or the lettuce wouldn't be frozen, it'd be refrigerated. But yeah, you take that stuff, and then as it's on its way, it's got to get there in something. So if it's coming from Mexico or Peru, or even from just down the road, all of it gets packaged, of course. The classic question people ask with packaging: paper bags, plastic bags, glass. There's all these different kinds of containers and systems that we have to be able to contain and preserve freshness. And one thing that's important to recognize before we talk about packaging at all is actually that the most important job for packaging is to preserve the food. Because in our system it's so fragile right now. Food is so perishable, in terms of the way that we try to move it around, in this really fresh way, rather than, again, whether that be fermenting or salting or drying, however you might be preserving food. And so it's crucial that it is actually packageable, because the impact of that food being lost is going to outweigh the packaging 100 to 1. Um, but in terms of packaging, we have sort of plastic, glass, and paper as our sort of main methods for packaging. Um, and they all have sort of different varied impacts that are kind of hard to measure up against each other, but they all have some pretty significant strengths that we can play to in as we're going forward with our plans for our food systems. So if you think about, for instance, paper is great because it's obviously biodegradable. So you can throw it in a compost heap and it will disappear. Um, and it won't leave toxic stuff in the environment. And paper is really, really good for anything that needs to be disposable. So, for instance, if you think about anything that's going to get dirty, right, that you won't be able to recycle. So that's basically anything that's coming in contact with food. So almost all packaging um, could be like this, right? Unless it was washable. And that's the key to what plastic and glass is going to hold. But for paper, say you have meat that's coming and there's going to be juice on it and stuff, right? Paper can be composted. And so we can actually deal with that paper in that way. So in terms of the scant amount of disposable stuff that we want to go forward with, paper is a great choice because it means that we can actually compost it safely into the environment and it's not going to be a pollution problem. Then in terms of plastic and glass are both obviously great materials to make reusable containers out of. Right now we're using it for all kinds of disposable bags, disposable containers. Um, you know, Recycling with plastic is essentially a myth. Uh, while it might be possible, we certainly don't have the methods or the legal structure to be able to accomplish that. Um, but the big thing that we find with glass has a great upside as compared to plastic, but also a huge downside. And that is that glass is infinitely recyclable and very easy to recycle. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and you can do it forever. Glass doesn't degrade. You just melt it and create new glass. But it is dramatically heavier than plastic, and shipping things in glass is really hard. So for anything that sort of is something that's going to not go very far, it's going to be, it's you taking a glass jar to your grocery store to fill with something and take home, for instance, or, for a restaurant to go to and from, to and from, to and from, wherever it's getting its food from. That's a great option for glass. But if you're talking about shipping internationally, if you're talking about, any kind of distance with glass, it becomes quite heavy, and breakable, of course, too. And that's where reusable plastic containers might start to be an important part of our packaging situation.
And I think an important leading question, really, for the whole episode should almost be sort of what happens to our food when we change the way that we process and prepare it. And you've already sort of given us a hint in terms of the difference between, say, a culture of food which preserves it through salting and other forms of preservation versus, okay, we do the flash frozen method because we want to preserve freshness, but also because food is, as we've already said, it's not just perishable, it's almost hyper perishable. Its perishability is heightened because of global trade, because of the global supply systems, which have their own vulnerabilities as well, of course. And this is highlighted once more with glass. I mean, the reason why we have glass, and therefore the reason not only that we have a particular sort of maybe failed recycling system, has a lot to do with the heaviness factor. And the difference between a food system that has glass as a means of transporting will actually affect the food. You know what I mean? And because it'll affect the basic process of how the food is getting prepared, which is pretty much, again, as we've said, what food is. And I love that point that you made about 100-to-1, about the fact that the packaging quickly, if you're compromising the freshness, the packaging kind of disrupts the economics, which shows us just how unbelievably fragile actually the global food system is. I think there's this idea that it's very efficient. And in some senses, it's very efficient. It has this kind of remarkable commercial efficiency, very superficially. But many of the costs are not integrated into sort of the final calculation. The disruptions to food security, food affordability. Obviously, we can look in the environmental impact. We see it with plastic recycling. And again, food itself, food as a sort of cultural product, medium of its own, food as a sort of social product, as a kind of meeting place, food as a reflection of lifestyle, as a way of how lifestyle is organized. Like, I think there's no question that the way that we eat now absolutely reinforces a certain lifestyle. So there's something very, very crucial to the process there, and our capacity to control process over determines the kind of food that we have at the end of the day.
Right, and that's so obvious when you look at the kind of food that we're eating, right? If you look at and the times in which we eat it, the ways in which we eat it, refrigeration, like many of the other things we talked about on green priorities, is very much a everything all the time, anytime you want it technology. It really brings you, again, it removes seasonality, it removes the time of day that you're eating things. It goes with the air conditioning in your house that keeps the space comfortable so you can be eating hot food in the middle of a super hot summer day. It's one of those, our food system is exactly that same representation. I can eat an avocado from Peru in the dead of winter, in Canada, kind of thing. And I think that that's something that we obviously we really want to question going forward, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from like sort of a social texture perspective, like we talked about before. People are happy when there's when they are actually, in real relation to the environment that they live in, and when things sort of work better in that way, when they actually are connected to the material reasons that their food look a particular way.
And I think this sort of formula of anywhere all the time, which we saw, as you mentioned, in energy and see again in our food systems, maybe the reason why there's this pattern is because if we look specifically at agriculture, it is a system of commercial distribution. It has very little to do with food. It has to do with preserving commercial relationships. It has to do with preserving stability. I mean, a good example of this is that, The Economist releases a big index called the Global Food Security Index. And what people underestimate about these reports is they talk about affordability, they talk about availability, they talk about quality, and they even talk about sustainability. But when you go and you break down their definitions and their metrics, the signal thing that they're trying to communicate is stability in the food system. That means stability in the global chain of food. There might be, the occasional emphasis on female farmers and their independence and the importance of a farmhold as a piece of property and the social value of that in say countries in the global south, for instance. But for the most part, it's a giant ad for the stability of the underlying commercial relationships of the food system itself, which is, again, to put it bluntly, a giant business. And additionally, these reports themselves have a big impact on how that stability itself is reinforced. Anyone who knows anything about economics knows that what you say about what's going to happen in markets has a big impact on what ends up happening in those markets. The way that you signal optimism or pessimism, interest or disinterest, is the bread and butter of how trades and markets are organized. People either are going to buy or they're not. They're either going to support this way of doing things or they're not. But of course, it's organized as a market affair. So these kinds of indices, such as our global food security index, are about trying to ultimately reinforce the stability of the underlying relationships, much as we do in our monetary systems when our interest, say a central bank's interest with target inflation, is entirely stability, the stability of a monetary flow, by extension the stability of capital, which means the stability of markets to continue doing their job of organizing and regulating everything, seemingly at the expense of the very systems themselves, which they're meant to be, of course, regulating.
And that's obviously true too for the inverse of that, which is if you then try to introduce seasonality back into a commercial system, you find that actually it reacts quite violently to the idea that things aren't going to be always available, that maybe you can't actually have that kind of food at this time of year. And people say, well, the tomato market's going to go down because obviously there won't be any tomatoes in the winter, for instance.
And I wonder also whether the idea of this anytime, anywhere um, also is a sort of false freedom sold to the consumer, because it's a freedom that markets exercise, but people are not necessarily supposed to. And this is one of the paradoxes of consumer markets, is that we're of course sold the idea that we should be able to have this anytime, from anywhere and in any amount. And we do our best to produce things like grocery stores and other institutions to service us with this idea that we see appearing in markets also, the anytime, anywhere availability of a trade, of the capacity to participate in a market, the ultimate freedom of sort of modern liberal society. But maybe this is why we have like this sort of inexplicable ecological effect, these environmental impacts that just we don't have a good read on, even in the sustainability side of, again, the aforementioned reports. It's sort of like trying to rein in a central bank, um, who, on the one hand, is talking about sober monetary policy while bankrolling massive multi-billion, multi-trillion-dollar stimulus, for global markets to continue their predatory commercial practices. It's not really so different, in terms of these reports that might be sort of superficially interested in getting sustainability back. But maybe the reason why we have sustainability issues in our food system is because the operative principles of the food system, once again, do not come from agriculture. They come from the commercial practice of markets. And this creates a gap between what can actually be guaranteed in practice, whether it's on the consumption side or the distribution side, or in fact, back to the earlier stages of growing, and the concept of the food system itself, and obviously these really important commercial practices, without which we imagine civil society and our economy would be blind. It would be basically totally dysfunctional.
Definitely. I think that moving forward, thinking about sort of packaging or transportation, either way, that is the kind of texture that we have to figure out a way of introducing, possibly slowly at first, in sort of again in a slow descent away from our current sort of commercial methodologies. Um, One of the things I think that's interesting that we talked a little bit before the episode about whether that's something that would be preserved or not is the idea of, say, the parts of our global food system right now that exist that are sustainable or can be sustainable, that it will introduce new modern textures to people's lives, but that are presently, massively entangled with these kinds of global markets that are organizing, say, the transport of huge amounts of oranges on ships from Peru or from or bananas or whatever you might be bringing up on ships that we can see in the future actually a sustainable future of that adds, okay, well now you can have actually some fresh fruit all winter. It just can't be any fresh fruit. It's got to be these couple of kinds of fresh fruit that we can transport.
Or we have to have that bigger discussion around what is then going to counterbalance those parts of our food system that maybe should remain global versus those parts of our food system which should remain domestic, need to be reinforced as a domestic practice. It seems as if we don't really have uh, the societal or even agricultural setup to do this. I mean, pushed to its end, very controversially, you might even say that farmers in Canada are not really different from any other commercial business. And again, they suffer the boom and bust cycle that they do because once again, there is no alignment between agriculture and this commercial system in which we put an enormous amount of faith. And over time, since the birth of modern agriculture, this gap has grown bigger and bigger. Um, but yeah, looking again to the sort of the technical breakdown, then from again, we've looked at refrigeration, we've looked at the packaging. We also have we have these sort of macro transportation links as well. We have the planes and the trucks, etc. How do they fit into this puzzle?
Yeah, and so going forward, we'll have to think about the different roles that they'll play. You know, Obviously we're not going to be carrying food around on bikes. So we have these are the main options right now. We have trucks, we have planes, and we have boats, really, really big boats. Um, and boats are basically the sustainable way, mostly, as good as it comes for transporting food around. Um, Obviously, trucks are going to be, involved at some point because you have to get it from the boat to the grocery store to people, or, at some point it's going to be traveling over land. Airplanes are, as everyone would imagine, not particularly a great way of moving food around. Pretty intensive to do. But airplanes are actually used quite extensively in the wintertime, particularly where we live in Canada, because fresh fruit that actually will perish before it gets to Canada on a truck has to be sent on an airplane. So some of the most sort of carbon intensive food you can buy at a grocery store is, say, asparagus in the winter kind of thing. These foods that are transported on airplanes have a massive carbon footprint. But again, when it comes to foods that can either have a very long shelf life, so like think like apples or potatoes, and obviously lots of grains and things, those can be transported on boats. But so can things like oranges and bananas because they can actually ripen on the boats, which is sort of an interesting piece of those particular types of food can actually be transported very long distances at scale, which makes them sort of a possible part of, say, a solar punk future, the kind of you're going to have a big boat with covered in solar panels that actually can bring you oranges, that we can actually improve, say, that aspect of life. Maybe you can actually have fresh fruit in the wintertime in Canada because it can come, these particular kinds of fruit can come because of this new technology that we have. um, but again, right now what we're doing is just overstepping that, and we're also trying to transport every kind of fresh fruit that we can around the world on airplanes mostly. um, and trucks obviously are a similar story depending on what you're moving, depending on how far away it's grown, basically. They're a similar intensity to airplanes, um, amazingly, because they're a lot less, because they carry sort of stuff that lasts a little bit longer, but a lot more of it gets lost, kind of thing.
Yeah, it would seem that we don't, the asparagus in winter example obviously reaffirms what we've been saying about a commercial system of distribution versus sort of a proper system of distributing food and agriculture with emphasis on things like natural perishability or long shelf life or ripening. To get here, though, to get where these are the principles, say the principles of a food system would be, you would actually be interested in ripeness. Of course, we sell the concept of ripeness, all of fresh fruit as a commercial enterprise. It's important that a banana looks like a banana, that it is ripened. And I suppose it's sort of a happy accident in many ways when our food um, can take time to ripen. It can even lower the cost, and then we can get things for cheaper as opposed to more expensive. Whereas obviously buying certain kinds of products in the dead of winter are going to be reflected in the price. But this is an interesting point in and of itself. The fact that we can buy anything, The fact that you can, if you pay the right price, maybe there are certain transactions that shouldn't be commercial, which means you cannot effectively buy anything. And one of the problems of this, obviously, is that for many people, they identify their hard-earned political liberty with this very capacity to purchase. And it's very, very difficult to explain how the capacity to purchase comes at the expense of a bunch of other freedoms that you're not necessarily going to think about. And some of those freedoms are going to be sort of implicit in the goods themselves. Again, talking about ripeness, it's a great example because the ripeness of the banana or the ripeness of the oranges is not necessarily why they are in the final analysis put in ships and sent to us. There just is a market for oranges and bananas, and the success of that market is very important in the much wider economy that includes food, but includes everything else from clothes to pharmaceuticals to and everything in between. So, it's a political challenge to try and get an agricultural system of distribution for agriculture that has these kinds of built-in principles that actually have to do with food. Again, to mention that index once more, within the index is very little mention of food itself. There's a mention of a bunch of economic practices, technical practices, political practices around policy and advocacy and the distribution of funding. But there's very little about food, which is sort of funny. Food itself as a concept, food itself as a technology, as a material, is not relevant because the principles of agriculture that we might find in our soil and then in the food itself, and then again, as we've already been discussing, when you break down something like distribution and you look at all the different operative concepts from when you get hyperperishability or what it means to flash freeze and selling the fiction of freshness. It's understandable that we probably could figure out a way to emphasize food as a concept, as a material, and as a technology, but it would come at the great political expense of the present system, which again exists for the kind of Faustian purpose of maintaining commercial stability at any cost, come what may to the consumer. And the question is, at which point does this become bad enough for the consumer or for people or for food systems or the ecologies that support our food systems that we say, okay, this is we don't produce food anymore. We produce kind of something that sort of looks like food, but all of its aspects, the culture that go around it, even its nutritional aspects, and maybe the politics that once came with growing our own food have essentially been lost.
Exactly. And I think the legal structures that are in our way, sort of between these different, in almost all of these different struggles, you can find these very, very liberal points, small L liberal points, about around say food safety or around the various ways in which we produce food, who can produce it and where they can produce it. And, again, the same goes for all the different packaging problems we have. We have these interesting legal problems that lead to sort of a championing of, say, food safety, right, in this case. So say, take the example of expiry dates. You have a date that's sort of mostly arbitrarily put on the food. Back in the day, most of the expiry dates that were put on food were added just arbitrarily because they made it a requirement. Even something like salt has an expiry date, even though it's a rock. And I think that you have this really interesting piece of our food system that's actually so much more arbitrary than people think. Best before date is generally a when it's freshest kind of thing, which is determined by scientists in the lab who, I don't know, test the nutritional content after 3 weeks and say it's gone, it's a little bit less than it used to be. You know, but because that's so deeply ingrained in our systems now, it means that, in terms of how you can store food, how you can preserve food, um, who can make and process food, and where and how and with what, all of these things are so mired in legal and commercial issues that it's really, really difficult to sort of jumpstart any kind of new food system. certainly the processing is one of the most challenging parts.
The legal system is in a funny way not so different from the ecological costs. Far from the legal system being the ultimate instrument of enforcement, the law is actually this place where all of the dysfunction of the system has to be captured, particularly in something like regulation. Regulatory frameworks are the ultimate interruption of commercial practice. Like, if you're at least a sort of shameless, you know, businessman, you don't necessarily care about expiry date or perishability. For you, it's about getting a product as quickly to market. And it's often the responsibility of regulatory agencies, of food boards, of national governments, etc., to say, oh, no, we have to put in certain standards. And we don't just see this in our food system, we see it in healthcare, we see it in education. In fact, all aspects of our society are legalized. And the funny sort of paradox of the law, in a sense, is that on the one hand, we get these kinds of protections, at the same time as we get these kinds of enforcements that make it very, very difficult to change the system, and we continually generate further legal blockages that are there to kind of protect us. But their ultimate aim, kind of, you could almost say spiritually, the ultimate aim of the legal system is to reinforce commercial practice. I mean, in the modern sense, that's why you put an expiry date. It's not actually it's about the consumer to the extent that the consumer as a concept needs to be protected and reinforced. And in the same way that, we talk about free trade, and there are organizations that exist to legislate and judge trade disputes, where there's suspicion that people are, not breaking the law, because this is one of the difficult things about something like international trade. You can pursue, if you have a trade agreement, extraordinary legal practices, but in many cases there are all these black holes. But yeah, the funny thing, the irony of the legal system is that we become very responsible for maintaining, legalization and regulation, and it's presented as this system of protections. But the law ideally is supposed to be, it kind of clears the way for a definition, say, of a new sort of social practice we don't understand. That's probably the best use of regulation, and in that sense, the law could be the ultimate friend of trying to figure out how to negotiate, new agricultural practices, or new ways of introducing definitions of food into trade systems, or adapting global trade to a new paradigm of exchange, etc. But clearly it is, and maybe this is why it also is it contains all of these alienated, undealt with disputes, lawsuits galore, big, huge conglomerates, agro conglomerates, taking whatever options they have legally to destroy the viability of other companies to compete with them. Obviously, the classic example is the domination of the seed market, the use of patent laws, like in patenting in particular, it defends competition on the one hand, but it's also trying to preserve the concept of originality on the other by saying, well, you found it first, but competition is supposed to be, in a sense, you would think, almost at the expense of originality. So these kinds of paradoxes, which are not solved by markets, but which markets have no choice but to kind of generate and then send to the courtroom, is a prime example of another kind of big cost of the unfinishedness of the present design of our system.
And that legal sort of bloat that we find in our system also means that we have trouble using sort of a lot of traditional methods too that we use for food preservation, on a small scale, certainly, whether that be in your home, again, preserving meat, fruit, whatever it might be, all of those things. If you're canning it just for yourself, you can sort of get away with it. They'll let you do that. But as soon as you then start canning stuff and selling it to someone else, there's a huge amount of regulation that goes around what kinds of devices you can use to do that, and all the kinds of structures around that. But I think it's really, really crucial that we sort of find a way to either address legal problems, or more likely take down some of our legal regulations, but also reimagine what it means to make food and get away from commercialism a little bit. Um, Again, so we can bring back those textures, that seasonality. Um, a lot of people think about, for instance, with food, the lack of choice that's coming. If you're starting to look at seasonality, think, oh well, I'm not going to be able to have fresh food in the wintertime. That's going to suck. But at the same time, we have to recognize that some of our most treasured foods are foods that we used to eat in the winter, most importantly because they were methods of preserving that food. So whether that be cheese or cured meats or peaches that have been preserved with sugar and water and canned, at the peak of summer that then you can eat in the wintertime. And it's this amazing sort of gift in the wintertime to be able to make all these amazing, wonderful pies and soups and everything that they made in the wintertime with what they could. Those textures coming back are such a crucial part of what we want to build. It's not just about necessarily the destruction of an old system, but also the construction of new cultural traditions and also revival of old ones for sure.
With maybe an emphasis on going forward in terms of designing a new food system, by sort of figuring out again this relationship between the process of food with the food that you end up having on your table. And again, we've broken down the conventional parts of food sort of processing and distribution, and we've looked at refrigeration, and we've looked at packaging, and we've looked at transport, and we've seen how this affects food. It absolutely affects the food that you have and the consumption habits that you have and the consumption expectations, and then all the weird political consequences of it, the unexpected lossages, slippages of free choice. And definitely when you look at the legal system on the one hand, but on the other side, in a bigger way, just your capacity to even operationalize, say at scale, a different agricultural system will involve a complete collision between you and the existing way that we do things and the underlying axioms of commercialism. And preservation, in a sense, is kind of really this brilliant paradigm of, it has tremendous historical roots, but it's also clearly something we should probably bring back as a concept, as a process. It's a process we don't have, in a sense, that could so easily be part of the basics of our food distribution system. Maybe that's why it feels like such an essential piece of the puzzle that could so easily be there. But of course, the concepts that we operationalize, that we mobilize in something like the practice of preservation, are very, very much opposed to this idea of a perfectly available, again, say fruit, etc., whenever and in whatever supply, that is more important to us than the food system. It's more important that, again, we have this eternal or sort of fiction of the stability of the capacity for the global system to function at the expense of the food system itself. Its quality, its resiliency, its stability, and it's very, as we're noticing, kind of the social materiality of the food system. And you mentioned in the past how many of our favorite foods, classic foods, come from preservation techniques, from yogurt and cheese, etc. That these sort of classic examples of rich, culturally created, generated foods, with a super, unbelievably tasty, but also rely upon processes that, something like, Parmesan is such a boutique process in a way, and it's a luckily preserved market in some respects because the consumer demand is huge and people are willing to pay for it. And it's not that it was necessarily ever cheaper. It's probably maybe never been cheaper. But again, cheapness here is one of these kind of great illusions, because when you look into the details of something like, Parmesan, the process of preservation is not. It's part of what makes it a kind of, not a luxury good, but one of those great Italian goods that reinforces Italian tourism and reinforces Italian identity and reinforces, in the same way, again, this is the the idea here, in the same way that when I release my report rather, that says our food systems are happy, or our quarterly reports for our company are up, it literally affects markets. People trade more optimistically, and the same thing can happen with nations. And if you have a really good consumer product like Canadian maple syrup or Italian cheese, you can surprisingly protect ways of doing things that are maybe really expensive and require a process like preservation that isn't present maybe in significant parts of our food system, except for maybe a couple of these sort of classic goods, which shouldn't convince us, in other words, that we are doing preservation at scale, or that any more than the ripeness of the banana is practically important to the way it's shipped. It's a kind of accident of commercial practice that we can ship bananas, not a priority of our food system. Okay, so let's just have global shipping for fruit that can ripen. The same is true of cheese. It's a luckily protected good, but it's not the same as having a food system that is actually based, that has the practice, say, of preservation in it.
Or yeah, that it knits together our food system with preservation. That it's yeah, exactly. It's incidental, but not a thoughtful part. Um, yeah, and going forward and sort of thinking about how we're going to design our food system, these are the kinds of things we have to think about. Preservation of food, how's that going to work? Greenhouse gas emissions generally from refrigeration make up a huge proportion of our energy use in our emissions every year. Around 2.5% of our global emissions come from the cold chain. And when you consider that it's also not prevalent in lots of places in the world in the way it is in North America, it's a huge impact. And preservation is like one of these major, major techniques that we've really forgotten its importance in our system. And I think depending on where you live and the kinds of food systems, we talk a lot about winter here, obviously because we live in Canada, but there are lots of places in the world, for instance, that will preserve things only for a short period of time because they don't have a winter. They can actually keep growing. They just need something to put it in their house. So they'll have cold cellars, or they'll have clay pots with water on them. That's the traditional method for cooling stuff down in really hot places. Um, but depending on where you are, you'll have different seasonalities and different ways of producing the food. And I think we either have to rebuild a legal structure that can reflect that somehow, or really think about what we would replace our current legal structure and commercial structure with to be able to bring back the prevalence of food preservation, understanding what's coming from where and how it's getting here as well.
Well, if we've spoken about how the way you process the food affects the food, it also goes back the other way, which is, okay, the food you end up producing is going to affect the processes. And that means that if we look at lifestyle, well, the food that you're eating is going to affect your lifestyle. And there are ways that we can sort of technically install this, and we can talk about the freedom of having control of your own food system, or say having a food system that is insulated from things like famine, or in a more economic terms, big price shocks. It's going to be important that you look at what kind of lifestyle you have the opportunity to build up in the first place. It's not it's not insignificant that we don't necessarily have food concepts in our food system. It will make a food system very, very, very vulnerable, because and actually price shocks are a good example, because price shocks are a very good example of this alienated effect, this sort of effect that kind of comes from nowhere, that definitely devastates the capacity, for instance, of the consumer to pay for something. But we can't explain in a very clear way, except through reference to the sort of objective setup of our global food trade, why some products are affected more than others, why there is this vulnerability in the first place, because it's a question of economics, not of food. And if there is an illusion that is generally pumped around, it's that, oh, but they're the same thing, because economics is just the sort of science of management, and therefore it's just the science of good productivity, yields, and that was something that we already interrogated in the very first episode, the concept of yield. And as a bit of a detour, there was a documentary produced in the 1980s in Quebec, and it's a very, very good example it's sort of a documentary of a sort of lost lifestyle. And its title is sort of, on the, sort of the remaining traces of dreams. And it interviews some people who lived on this island in the province of Quebec. And it sort of, as they discuss the loss of this integrated um, sort of shipping industry, which had less to do with shipping as such and more to do with these people who were able to go from the forest, cutting down the wood, to building the ships themselves, to navigating the ships and having a knowledge of the river or sea in which those ships were navigated. In other words, this unbelievably integrated lifestyle in which they worked. And there's a funny point in the documentary where one of the people describing this says, well, what happens when you become replaceable by basically commercial activity? They even refer directly to something like economics, which again I would reinforce is not this pure science again of good productivity or simple liberal competition and therefore freedom. It's a very specific way of practicing a certain kind of freedom or practicing a certain kind of social activity. But they say, once you get replaced, once you cannot be replaced by another person, you replace it, let's say, by a piece of technology, then you're replaceable kind of absolutely. There's no room for you, in a sense, anymore in that system. And what you're reduced to, and there's this funny phrase, is you're reduced to kind of a lunchbox worker, is literally the phrase they use. We've all seen those images of them building, the great cities of North America, for instance, these men on these huge skyscrapers, the exposed steel beams with their lunchboxes, eating them. And in other words, you're reduced to a person who does not have an integrated work, where there is no relationship anymore between the work that I do and the product of that work. And many people have written big theories about exactly this gap, and they've called it alienation in some contexts and so on, but it's a very simple problem. And the chief difficulty is not even just actually politically, in terms of getting back the freedom to exercise our own work. The problem is, one, we don't know what work we want to do, and in the context of a food system, that's quite a vulnerable position to be in. Not having a relationship to food, not knowing how your food is grown, not knowing where your food comes from, and then eventually, politically not having a say in how it's set up, but also on the ecological side, like that are we're crippling the support systems of the food themselves, the capacity within practical timelines to see our food systems revived as food systems. You know what I mean? And this documentary and this quote is extremely instructive in terms of what the goal is going forward. It's like, well, how do you build an integrated food system? And integration means the work part, it means the product of the food, it means this relationship between process and food, food and process, or lifestyle and food, food and lifestyle. And what we pretty much fundamentally lack is just a concept or knowledge of this relationship itself. Right? We lack a sense of responsibility for the feedback loop itself.
And I think as we're sort of nearing the end of the episode, we should talk about, we've finished this big series on food today, our fourth episode. We should think about sort of what our closing ideas and our thoughts maybe on what a better food system looks like. What are the challenges, but also what are some of our solutions and suggestions, at least for a jumping off point for anyone thinking about what we might do to fix our food system and what it might end up looking like one day.
Well, yes, some examples you've already given include making preservation a more vital process. You've mentioned in the past at scale polyculture, agrozones. You mentioned living fences versus steel fences. When to use which? Maybe you could sort of break down some of these alternatives for us.
Yeah, and so the living fence and the steel fence are good. We talked about living fences with Firkra when he was on the podcast with us, and living fences are a great sort of example of what we're talking about here. A living fence is sort of it's a fence, but it's also so much more than a fence. And unfortunately, our system only sees fences as fences. And so the cheapest fence is obviously the one where you cut the wood down quickly, you get it there, you build the fence. But it doesn't take into account that the living fence, which you might have to wait a bit for, then also provides you with firewood. It also provides you with with maybe some berries or whatever else that fence might grow. But a steel fence is a sort of at the opposite end, where this is an expensive fence, but that will last for a really, really, really long time, or it's a very, very, very strong fence. And the key is just knowing, having the wisdom to know when to use each of these different fences. And that's something that we really, really lack right now. So I think that, in our food system, that means looking at polyculture and localized seasonal food systems as our major production source. Most of what we're eating is going to come from nearby. It's going to be, particular local varieties of various different things that are tried and true, that are resistant to the kinds of conditions that we find here in Canada, and also looking forward to some of the changing conditions in Canada that we might see going forward. In terms of preservation, it means, preserving food, eating our preserved food in the winter, and, storing again the food, the energy that is required to can that food in the summertime when we have lots of plentiful energy, so it's there for us in the winter, and sort of allowing there to be differences in our seasons to sort of, again, build back a real social network and social obligation to food. And then again, allowing for then, modern technology to make these new impacts. Okay, well, we have changed. There is, we don't have to, wait till summer to be able to eat lettuce necessarily. Maybe we do want to make that particular kind of food available. So maybe that means smaller fridges. Maybe it means food that's coming from, closer at at very small, much smaller scales than we're trying to produce, and bring in lettuce right now. Whether that means you eat sort of like a fresh vegetable every couple of days in the winter rather than 4 or 5, servings in a day. Um, you know, all of these things, or whether it means, the things that are uh, producible and exportable around the world, again, our grain, our potatoes, these kinds of staples that maybe actually, we could have global trade for, because it allows us to actually stabilize, say, if there's a drought somewhere, where we could bring in food so that, again, people aren't starving in that place. But again, only using, importing potatoes from Canada, into Canada from somewhere else, if we have had a problem with our production that season, and we need the food. Introducing some of those ideas back into our food system is the crucial step, but also not forgetting that we do have new technologies that we can use, and that can actually help us to not only to preserve old traditions, but also to create new ones that we can have all over the world.
And the conflict isn't going to be between technology and sort of non-technological agriculture. The point is about choice. Do we have, when it comes to what we're emphasizing, do we think about, okay, the difference between a steel fence and when it makes sense versus a living fence and when it makes sense? Sure, if we wanted to have a bunch of steel fences and a bunch of fresh cabbage in winter, we just have to confront the context and the conditions and the consequences of that choice. And right now, the setup of our agricultural system means we actually don't have a choice. And that's the irony. And in fact, I would say that generally this sort of economics as a whole makes it such that we don't have a choice, and we call that freedom. And there's a great importance again to the fiction of, well, nobody actually can interrupt this system, because that's its stability. Like this is, at the core, the DNA of all, from our money to the sustainability and stability of trade, etc. Any fundamental commercial process, indeed the very definition of a commercial process in some senses, is kind of reducible in our present system to something that nobody could dream of interrupting, and that invulnerability to involvement, participation, and decision making. Well, guess what? Turns out that those then become the properties, for instance, of your food system, and it becomes very difficult to produce food that makes sense. Even again, like when you look at, what is a steel fence to us now? Again, it's either the emergency solution to some social practice. It's absolutely needed, and we have to fork out the money no matter what comes, or it's rather like our banana. Not in terms of it has this quality of ripeness and there's this sort of priority and thoughtfulness in terms of looking about how it interacts with the processes of distribution and eventual consumption. No, steel fences are sold in the same way that bananas are sold. They're sold with this idea that they have this kind of stability, that they kind of have this usefulness that doesn't expire, that isn't contingent upon participation. I mean, for this reason, the living wall is the ultimate example of something with which you have to participate. And the timelines of a living wall seem to be in direct contradiction with the fact that we do not have a concept of time right now in our food system that involves our participation. In that sense, the present system will never come up with a living wall except as a very, very boutique, therefore over-expensive policy. And the threat of boutique policies is that they do threaten stability. And they do threaten something like the stability of our monetary system. And we can't just scoff at this because we're unbelievably dependent upon this kind of stability, even if it doesn't favor us. And therefore, it is about exchanging one form of commercial stability for another. An emphasis on the properties of food might seem naive or short, or sort of small-minded or short-sighted, but it's not at all, because it's the ultimate organizational challenge to try and say, okay, yeah, how can you increase participation, increase interaction? Oh, guess what? It actually affects the quality of the food, and it affects the nature of the food, the social nature of the food. And considering that we already live in a food system that seems to be so deprived of its foodiness, you might say, or there is such a big gap between the ugly food in the supermarket that doesn't get sold but gets thrown out and the perfect looking food, which has very little to do with the fact that perfect food is any better, is any more delicious or any more nutritious. In fact, often the opposite is the case, right? There's often, food that isn't engaged with is not really food after a certain point. I mean, that is a kind of vital concept of food, of ecology. And the question is, how do you design a counterbalancing and supportive political system that can figure out the logistics and the techniques and the stability of a food system that prioritizes participation, engagement, materiality, and the properties of food themselves. That was our last episode on food. In the coming weeks, we'll discuss alternative materialities and continue the conversation on how to structure and think the green transition. This has been Green Priorities. Thank you for listening.